Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2017 Texas A&M University System Technology Summit. We are thrilled to have attendees from across the state joining us here today. My name's Dee Childs, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Information Officer for Texas A&M University. This is also my first time at Tech Summit, so I'm especially excited to be here today. Of course, you know, CIOs don't really do anything. We have staff, and or as I like to say, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And there are a lot of giants in this room that we get to thank for this wonderful summit. So first of all, I want to give a huge thank you to the committee members, the track chairs, the peer jury, and all the volunteers that make this conference possible. So could you all just please join me in thanking the committee? And next, I want to thank Beth Simone Novak from Yale University for being here. And I can't wait to hear her thoughts on tackling higher ed challenges with crowdsourcing and big data. I'm also very grateful to the CIOs from Baylor, the University of Texas, and the University of Richmond. They'll be joining together for a CIO panel tomorrow. Tech Summit truly is the place where IT professionals across the state of Texas, the Texas A&M system, come to learn, collaborate, and explore our common challenges as we move our organizations forward. I'm thrilled that we're tackling topics like big data, leadership in IT, transformational learning, discovery and innovation, and all those increasing demands that those topics place on our technology and our organization. So on behalf of the Tech Summit Committee, I hope you have a fantastic time this week. Thank you so much.
And now I'm pleased to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Professor Beth Simone Novak. Ms. Novak is the go-to expert on fusing innovation with leadership at the highest level. As the United States' first Deputy Chief Technology Officer, she founded the White House Open Government Initiative. Beth is a professor at Yale University, where she teaches the Governance Innovation Clinic at Yale Law School and directs the GovLab, which is a think and do tank that designs, tests, and implements technology, policy, and strategy for fostering collaborative approaches in problem solving, decision-making, and effective governing and collaboration, and doing all this with public partners. Sounds like a pretty serious role to me. She is the author of numerous books and articles about the impact of technology on governing, and her newest book, The Public Entrepreneur, will appear with Yale University Press next year. You can follow her on Twitter via her handle @BethNovak. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Beth Simone Novak.
Thank you very much, Josh. I also want to thank Dee for the warm welcome, and Adam for getting me here, and Lacey for getting me out of here. She'll be keeping the time and making sure we have plenty of time, I hope, for discussion. Since I have both the great honor and the challenge of talking about the impact of technology on governing, in a time, let's just say, in which maybe more of us are paying attention to how we govern than we have typically in the past. So let me start with a favorite example of mine. It's a project I've been tracking for years and one I can't say enough about. It comes out of the fire department of San Ramon, California. Some of you may know that we have about 425,000 sudden cardiac arrests each year, about 1,000 that happen each day, and that people are dependent on, of course, first responders, that is government, fire, police, et cetera, coming to their aid in the event that that happens to conduct, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, to apply a defibrillator, et cetera, to do the things that we need to do. And for every minute sooner that you get treatment when you have sudden cardiac arrest, increases your chances of survival by 50%. So enter San Ramon, California. It turns out that 57% of adults in the United States say they've had CPR training, And yet only 11% have ever used that training. I'm sure those numbers, if I asked you to show your hands how many people have used their CPR training, let's just see. How many people have ever had to use their CPR training? A very small number of people. I don't want to ask the circumstances, but we're glad that you have it. So what they did was they used new technology, namely they built an app. They combined it with a feed of open 911 data, and they built an app to co-locate people who have CPR training with victims suffering sudden cardiac arrest. Suddenly we go from here to this as the coverage level in California when they first begin. Now, in the first few years of the program, they have already been activated over 17,000 times and have 50,000 volunteers signed up to use the app. PulsePoint is just one example, and it's my favorite one, of ways in which we are using technology to help make our public institutions, to help make the solving of public problems, in this case saving lives, more effective, more open, and more engaged with citizens. In this case, PulsePoint combines two new innovations in how governments and public institutions more broadly are starting to work. It depends upon that open data feed of 911 calls, as well as then on crowdsourcing people who have a particular skill, in this case, CPR training. So what I want to do today is to talk about some of these new tools in the toolkit. Open data and crowdsourcing are two of them. And I also want to talk about data collaboratives and about open innovation and prizes and challenges as four of the new tools in the toolkit that we have available to us today to solve public problems. We need these innovations. We all know that the institutions we have, and I'm not speaking about federal or state or local, I'm not talking about one kind of institution or another, all of our institutions could become more effective than they are today. In many places and countries, the challenge is one of corruption. But even when that's not the case, we know that our traditional institutions are suffering from a deficit of trust. They're suffering from a deficit of agility. The people that we are trying to serve don't believe we're serving them as well as we ought to. So you can see the numbers, and they are across the board. I'm giving you some federal numbers, but they apply at the state level, they apply internationally. People don't believe that government and public institutions are working as well as they ought to. And again, it's not limited to government institutions, it's all kinds of traditional centralized institutions, soccer being a good example, the Olympics being another. People don't trust that institutions work as well as they ought to. So we have this mandate, you have this mandate as stewards of the public trust and as leaders of public technology to do and act differently, to be able to use your technology skills to help your colleagues to change how we do things in our institutions and also in our communities more broadly. So as much as today people are on both sides or all sides of the political spectrum unhappy about the economy or unhappy about immigration or unhappy about whatever the partisan political issue is of the moment, underlying all of these partisan political debates is the fact that we are not functioning as well as we can in how we make decisions and solve problems. So let me say at the outset, this is not a partisan issue. I'm not talking about the choice between policy A or policy B. I'm talking about how we make policy, how we deliver services, the way that we solve problems, which we can do better and differently today thanks to new technology. So let me talk a little bit about what some of these new tools in the toolbox are, if you will. If we think about the state in the 21st century, one of the first, I think, new innovations that we're seeing is obviously the use of data in the way that we make decisions and solve problems. So take, for example, the earthquake that happened in Nepal back in 2015. You may remember it was the worst earthquake Nepal had seen in 80 years. It was a 7.8 on the Richter scale. You had 9,000 people killed. You had hundreds of thousands of people displaced. As bad as this disaster was, it wasn't as bad as it could have been in terms of devastation and lives lost and displacement, because of a program that was started 1 week before the earthquakes began, but is now an ongoing program to help improve conditions should something occur again, and it will occur again. Namely, a program to open up data from the government of Nepal, data collected by the UN, and data collected by Ncell, which is Nepal's largest mobile operator, anonymized data that was then opened up and shared. This data was combined and handed to a nonprofit in Sweden called Flowminder, and used then to map population movements, track where people were migrating to, and enabled the better targeting of relief efforts to, again, improve the recovery and return to normalcy that happened in Nepal, and to help prevent other disasters in the future. So it's just but one example of the ways in which, and I'm going to show you some more, of the ways in which we are beginning to use data to solve not just small, but very large-scale problems. Partly because of the technology that's available. We have huge amounts of data now, and nobody, you come up with these stats every day. The latest one I've heard is 2.5 quintillion bytes of data created every day. I don't even know how much that is. That's a lot. 9/10 of the data we have today was created in just the 2 years preceding 2015. So you get these fabulous statistics about the volume of data exhaust that we're creating. But it's not the data by itself that's making a difference. It's the policies of open data, the fact that we are, as governments, as universities, as companies, beginning to move to open up and make that data available, freely available for reuse by third parties. Freely available not just to the people who collect the data, but to others who can bring their skills and expertise to the process of actually solving problems in new ways. So we see a spectrum of this range of open data policies, and I'm sure you're familiar with this from your own work, both data that you are putting up openly online in freely downloadable formats, and then on the other hand, data that because it contains personally identifiable information may in fact be more limited in its access to data that we actually see being held as proprietary and private. But we're seeing more of a shift towards this openness on the spectrum, again, by a variety of different players, precisely because when more people have access to the data, more people can collaborate on solving problems. This is beginning to become a movement. So we have now 70 countries who are party to the Open Government Partnership, who have made national commitments to opening up their data. I'm pleased to be in Texas, which is one of the few states at the state level that also has enshrined in legislation open data as a legal mandate. And we're beginning to see vast quantities of data becoming available, leading to significant global impact. There's the obvious impact that comes from the traditional notion of public institutions becoming more transparent, right? I open up data about how government spends money, I can scrutinize it and help to save money and help create more efficient government, decrease corruption. But there's exciting new developments in this open data story that are leading to interesting new outcomes. So when New York City opens the data it has, it's able then to build something called the Business Atlas, a tool which is designed to help small business owners and entrepreneurs to give them the business intelligence that a Starbucks has or a Gap has or a big company has, giving them data that allows them to know where should I open my business and where should I put my store. So it's leading to opportunities for job creation and economic growth because of the availability of that data. We're also seeing solutions to problems in new ways. My favorite example, the one from Mexico, Mejora tu Escuela. This again was a collaboration, government making some data available, in some case an NGO kind of demanding that data, turning it into a website that allows, first of all, citizens to make better choices about where to send their kid to school, to give them more transparency about the performance of their school, but interestingly, then also revealing, because you could scrutinize the data, that 1,512 teachers on the payroll all had the same birth date. All were born in 1912, and all were taking home pay higher than the president of Mexico. So you begin to see when you can make data available to more people, again, beyond the person who collects the data, get more eyeballs on the problem, we begin to have opportunities to solve not only the challenges that our own institutions have, making our own institutions work better, but giving citizens better choice, creating economic opportunity, creating jobs. Let me say a quick word about the challenges. Obviously, opening up data requires the desire to do so. And we can talk perhaps more in the Q&A about how we overcome, and that's potentially where FOIA and Freedom of Information Act requests come in. You know, there's not always a desire to open the data. And where there is a desire to open up the data, it sometimes requires investment to clean the data, to host the data, all the technical challenges that you know and deal with every day that are incumbent upon the people who are publishing and opening the data. There's also then the challenge of knowing what the data is that you need to solve what problem. We're seeing a movement towards opening data, but a lot of it is just data that's sitting out there with nobody yet that's using it to create any value. And then obviously we have to create incentives for people to use the data to solve problems and to work together. Well, one place, and this is the second tool in the toolkit I want to bring to your attention. It's one that I've already alluded to, but I want to make it more explicit, which is it's not just governments opening up their data or public institutions like universities opening up their data. What we're seeing are really interesting and creative public-private partnerships where companies and universities and governments are working together to open up their data, share it to generate value. So take, for example, Twitter. Twitter has made grants of data, if you will. They have a fire hose with 2 billion tweets and growing. And they've given it to the University of Wollongong in Australia, allowing researchers there to create flood maps to help alleviate flood conditions in Indonesia. Or they're giving data to Johns Hopkins to enable flu tracking. It's a little light, I don't know if you can read it, but they're giving data to Johns Hopkins to enable them to do more accurate flu prediction and flu tracking. In Kenya, Safaricom, the largest mobile phone provider, has given data to the Harvard School of Public Health to allow them to track incidence and the movement of malaria across Kenya. So we're seeing lots of examples of ways in which different collaborators are generating and creating public value by virtue of the fact that they're sitting on so much data. So we have satellite data, we have mobile phone data, we have the data exhaust that comes from everything we buy online and every call that we make. And when we have structures that allow us to marry that supply of data to the demand for it, to the desire to understand how populations move, the desire to understand where hotspots and incidents of disease or crime are, when we can combine these two things, and that's not an easy process, then we can solve problems in new ways. That data very much is generated increasingly by universities and research institutions. So it's not just universities using data to conduct research that come from other people. It's universities and research institutions, in this case, the Rothamsted Archive, for example, out of the UK, which is supplying real-time data on agriculture, data from experiments that they're running, and making them universally and openly available. As often as every 15 minutes, they're refreshing this data. Information on water runoff levels, soil moisture, meteorological data, soil nutrients, to aid and facilitate global collaboration around agricultural development. So we're seeing lots of ways in which these new kinds of partnerships are generating value. It's allowing us to get with much more data, better sort of real-time situational awareness of problems. It's allowing us to develop predictive algorithms with which we can solve problems, for example, like estimating who's going to be most likely to return to the emergency room, which students are most likely or at risk of committing or attempting to commit suicide. But it also allows us through these partnerships to create a flow and a supply and an exchange of talent that we might otherwise lack in some of our public institutions, helping us to better marry the talented people who are familiar with statistics and data science, computer science, who might be in a university, with governments or with companies who are in desperate need of not only the data, but the talent. So we see lots of opportunities now to exchange different types of data. It might be data of the kind I've been talking about, kind of passively contributed data that comes off of, let's say, a satellite feed that's tracking population movements. It might be anonymized data of things like call records or shopping records. But it might also be data that we're sharing intentionally, and that raises additional interesting challenges for the work that we do. So data that we're sharing when we contribute to a research trial, for example, through your Apple Watch, or with your doctor, where you're sharing data for research purposes, or perhaps data that you're going out and collecting, as my students did when they ran a project to go out and track the prices in stores in the little bodegas in the town we were working in to see if the prices were raised the day after food stamp benefits were given out, to understand whether there was an impact on benefits and price levels. So we're seeing lots of ways in which we are starting to share data through pooling of data, through research partnerships, where, for example, people from universities are going into companies like Facebook to do research and to use their data. But then also people giving data back to universities as trusted infomediaries, as trusted stewards of data, governments and companies asking universities like Chapin Hall in Chicago, like USC with its repository of data about children, where we are being asked in our role as trusted third parties to hold on to this data. Ultimately, these partnerships, whoops, I'm going to keep going here. These partnerships have a number of rationales, depending on where you sit. For us in universities, it might be about accelerating research. For companies, it's in many cases about the next wave of corporate social responsibility, right? It's about good stewardship, good marketing, to be doing the right thing. It may also be in some cases about selling data. It's not always open in the sense of free. It may be where companies are actually selling data to help solve social problems. But there are a number of different motivations behind why people are actually engaging in and motivated to engage in these sharing partnerships. However, there are risks and there are challenges. You are all very familiar, and I'm sure going to talk plenty over the next 2 days about issues of privacy when it comes to data. We're all worried about FERPA and HIPAA and accidental disclosures of personally identifiable information and legal compliance issues. But the issues are much broader than that across the life cycle of data collection. When we collect data in the first place, we have to worry about the fact that we are, for example, under-collecting data. So if we're engaged in a health research activity, are we just doing the clinical trial on middle-aged white males and not capturing data from other segments of the population, for example? My favorite example of late is the fact that the FBI has a national repository of crime data, but it's only on 8 kinds of crime. So we're doing a great job at tracking what we might think of as street crime, as violent crime, but we don't have national level data on white-collar crime, which means we don't have policies about this other kind of crime, no matter what its impact might be on the nation. So under-collection of data often leads to inaccurate analysis. We have problems with poor data governance, with the understanding of how to ethically share data between and among the right institutions, and knowing how to do that in a timely fashion. We have challenges with ensuring that data is clean. We have challenges with knowing, obviously, how to deal with security. Speaking of the open password, we all know the cybersecurity challenges are on everybody's lips. So there's a wide range of issues that we face, especially when it comes to sharing data that might not be anonymized, but might be either, that might contain personally identifiable data, or might be at risk of leading to re-identification of the data. I would be remiss, though, if I ended with talking only about the challenges that we face from trying to improve governing using data. So obviously there's a dramatic story going on about the impact of big data, about the impact of opening of that data to more people to solve problems, about the partnerships and collaborations, the data collaboratives that are emerging as a new kind of tool for solving problems. But it turns out, I'm gonna move to here, that there is another very important tool in the toolkit, which is the way that institutions can get smart, not from sensors, but also from people, right? So the crowdsourcing piece, the engagement piece has to be part of the story. In the first place, because every decision that we make are decisions that combine, obviously, information and facts that we need to know to make decisions better and more effectively. And at the same time, all decisions also have an element which are rooted in values. And getting at that understanding, both of facts and data, and also of values, is integral to solving problems in ways that are effective, but also that are increasingly legitimate. So we have lots of challenges, again, on the data side, but I want to talk for a minute also about the opportunities and the challenges that we face on getting smarter from people, and on the ways in which technology is helping us to get at what people know, what people think, what people believe, and also what they can do. So obviously, we've seen lots of experiments increasingly with ways of tapping into how people feel about a decision. So this is one of the few things that's still left on the White House website that remained from one administration to the next, is the We the People website is still up there. How many people have participated in a petition on We the People, have signed a petition? Josh, can I ask you, what did you sign? I may not ask you. That is because, I'm going to out you, you signed the Send Justin Bieber Back to Canada petition, didn't you? I could just tell. Two most popular petitions, Send Justin Bieber Back to Canada and Build a Death Star. Which one was it? Death Star, I knew it. It's a lot of geeky people in this room. We knew, this is, that was to be predicted. So this is of moderate usefulness. There's not a lot of response to these petitions because they are essentially asking people how they feel about something. Now, it's a really great advance over what existed before. There was no way to speak to the White House except to write a letter, which would go to the correspondence office, an office which is manned, and I mean this descriptively, with no value ascription, by blue-haired little old ladies. That's how it was described to me when I was there. So it's staffed by senior citizen volunteers, and one out of every few thousand letters is passed along to the president, but otherwise it was a formality, right? But this provides a direct and a transparent way to put things on the agenda, to say this issue, we care about this and it matters to us. So even though it's just a naked petition, it's just saying, hey, build a Death Star, it doesn't provide any blueprints for how to do that, doesn't ask you for your expertise for how to do that, it does help to gauge public opinion. And that may be a reason why this is one of the few things that has been held over between the Obama and the Trump administrations. But what we're seeing is lots of uses of technology now to ask people not just how they feel, but also what they can do. So to ask people to do things, to engage in tasks. So in Mexico City recently, friends of mine ran this challenge called the Mapaton Challenge, which was designed to get people who are riders of the informal kind of van services that go around Mexico City, for which there were no route maps, there were no timetables, there was none of the traditional things we associate with a public transportation system. They created an app that allowed riders to enter that data as they were riding. And in the space of 2 weeks, they had mapped the whole system, created the data you needed to know when the vans were coming, and then in turn, turn that into a tool that commuters could use to know when their van would come, and turn this informal system now into a real public transportation system. Again, not by asking people how they feel, but by asking them to perform a task. In the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the government, the municipal government, recognizing that they don't have as much expertise in IT as the citizens that they serve, asked people to teach them. They opened up a training school, they called the Open Government Training School, and they asked citizens to volunteer to teach courses in big data, in crowdsourcing, in data analytics, in data visualization, and they've already put 24,000 people through training programs, in this case, citizens teaching public servants how to use IT and innovation. We're seeing examples of public institutions increasingly asking people for their ideas. Yesterday in the news, there was a front page story that my own university, my home base is the NYU School of Engineering, we asked students and faculty and staff for ways that we should reduce the cost of our staggering, I can't even say the number, how much our tuition is. It's a staggeringly large number. And so we, for the first time, the administration turned to the students to say, how can we reduce the costs? And you know what? It turns out the students, for years, have had a hack, have had workarounds to the system that involved accelerating credits and finishing early, and they were able then to communicate that informal knowledge now to the broader population. It was on the front page of the New York Times this week, ideas for how to reduce the cost of your tuition. And you see in places like France, you know, I Have an Idea website. In Madrid, they have something similar. Countless institutions are turning to people to ask for ideas for how to solve problems. It is not just ideas, it's again asking people for expertise. My students and I worked on a project 10 years ago. It was the first real social media and expert network project in a government institution of its kind. We built, before Twitter, before Facebook, we built a website to enable volunteer scientists and technologists and engineers to supply information and know-how to the United States Patent and Trademark Office. An examiner in that office typically has 15 hours in which to examine a patent, do all the research and examine a patent application. So we said, well, we can do a little bit better by allowing people who actually know something about science and technology to share their expertise and their learning. There are challenges, though, to doing this well, right? Typically, when you put out a crowdsourcing call, when you ask people for good ideas or advice, you have to rely on them actually wanting to participate, on them wanting to participate well, and then on them even knowing about the opportunity to engage. So like PulsePoint, there's a similar project now in the UK called Good Sam. Again, Dr. Mark Wilson is the guy who created it. And he says, and I always find this kind of hilarious, he says, yeah, the big challenge is we have to find the doctor who's sitting in the pub. The Brits love their pubs, right? So his view is there's always somebody in the pub sitting next to you who could probably save your life. It's like they're like spiders, but you have to be able to locate them. So I don't know what spiders have to do with it, but I find it so perplexing, this analogy, that I wanted to share it with you. And the challenge is it's really hard to find that needle in the haystack. It's hard to find that spider. First of all, it's just culturally difficult to ask a question. So at NYU, we have never, we meaning the central administration, has never been in the practice of asking an open call question like this. It's just culturally not how we do things. We're supposed to have the answers. We're not supposed to have questions. And governments are much the same. It is a big and not to be underestimated cultural transition to be able to say, I don't have all the answers, or I need help. Typically, you know, if you're a techie, you're very familiar with going online to a place like Stack Exchange to say, what's the line of code that I need to compile XYZ, or what's the answer to this problem or that problem? It's not something we're familiar with in public institutions. We have a hard time getting expertise quickly. So in universities, typically we set up committees. The committees have a charter, they meet very slowly, they produce a PDF, and 2 years later, maybe a decision is made. Well, we have problems that we have to deal with now. We don't have time to set up advisory committees, which is what we do in the federal government, and we need ways of using technology to get at the right expertise and to get at it fast. We need the PulsePoint example. We need more ways of targeting the person who has CPR, which is the expertise you need if you're suffering sudden cardiac arrest. You don't need everybody. You need the people trained in CPR, and you need them right now. And that's where we're seeing new examples of uses of technology, for example, like expert networks, to better target what people know and can do. So at the World Bank, this is just one example, they have built now a directory of expertise of all 27,000 people who work there or who have worked there, including all of their consultants. And they have combined it with a help desk. So they have a phone number as well as a website so that when you need to know somebody who has dug a well in Sierra Leone, you can call the number or you can go on the website and say, who in our system has lived in Sierra Leone, has built a well, or who knows something about whatever the topic is. We're seeing increasing numbers of examples of the use of technology to target what people know, either on a broad scale like this one, or, for example, in New York City, where the mayor's office has built what they call the Volunteer Language Bank. They have built a website to track only a single skill of municipal employees, namely what languages they speak. So that when you get to the DMV and you speak one of the many languages people speak in a diverse city like New York, and they desperately need somebody to help to translate, and it's not Spanish or Chinese, which are well spoken by lots of people, they can quickly find somebody. They've used it, for example, this is a real incident where a Polish diplomat was out on a ledge threatening to commit suicide, and they needed a cop who spoke Polish now. Not later, but right now. So lots of examples in which we're seeing the uses of things like expert networks to better target what people know. We're also seeing the use, and this is the fourth and final tool in the toolkit I want to mention, and it's in a way not a technology, it's really an advance from the social sciences and the behavioral sciences, namely the uses of prizes and challenges to create incentives for people to participate. So whether it's the incentive for people to use data to create an app, whether it's incentives for people to share data, whether it's incentives for people to participate in a crowdsourcing exercise, we're seeing examples. Challenge.gov was a major one. 400 some, I think it's up to now 700 some challenges run by federal agencies to push out hard questions and ask people to solve them using the incentive of a prize. That prize is monetary sometimes, it's money. Sometimes it's glory, like shake the hand and meet the president. Sometimes it's a free t-shirt. But it's helping us to solve problems in new ways. So on challenge.gov, they had one of the many challenges that were up there. We're asking people to solve the problem of how to reduce the salt in salt water. The salt in salt water to improve agriculture in the developing world. You can imagine countless people at land-grant universities like this system who have that know-how and expertise, but are not otherwise connected to policy-making processes, don't talk to government, and don't have a way to share their know-how. So the combination of technologies for crowdsourcing, together with incentives that help people, encourage people to participate, are allowing us to solve problems in new ways. Another challenge that was up there was how to reduce the word gap, how to reduce the number of words that a poor child hears, the difference between what a poor child hears and a rich child between the time they're 5. It's a huge number of words that's based very much on class. And the Department of Education put out a challenge saying, can you help us to solve this problem? So we're seeing examples, and there are many more besides the ones that I've had time to show you today: open data, data collaboratives, crowdsourcing, and what I would call open innovation, the use of prizes and challenges as incentives, and the use of expert networks also as a way to do smarter, better crowdsourcing to allow us to get at that expertise better and more effectively. There are many challenges, though, that we face between the reality of how we govern and make decisions today and the way in which we might govern better tomorrow, using better evidence, using better human intelligence and expertise. We have, above all, I think, to ask ourselves, what are the ways in which, if we're to use technology to solve increasingly complex and hard problems, how are we going to build that culture of innovation? And I think sitting in universities, we have a special duty that's incumbent upon us to help to build that culture of experimentation and research that allows us to test whether and if and under what circumstances these new ways of working actually work better. We are familiar already with how to do research on the choice between two policies, but we don't have well-developed agendas in thinking about what is the difference in when we make a decision using an expert network versus not using an expert network. What is the difference between making a decision using a data collaborative that's set up as a data pool versus that's set up as an API? So we need to be able to advance our culture of understanding what works and what doesn't work. Academics are very loath, they do not like, for the most part, to talk about things like research in the wild under the messy, ugly conditions of the real world. These are not things we often like to describe as research. We like to do research in very pristine conditions with perfectly instrumented large dashboards that allow us to observe human behavior, where we have perfect sample sizes and we can run very neat experiments. Well, I would put to you that the perfect is very much the enemy of the good. If we believe that the goal of research, that the goal of universities, that the goal of education and our role is to help to solve societal problems for our students, for our community, and for the larger world of which we're a part, then we have to move past the concept of the perfect research experiment, the virtual lab, as some people call it, and to think about how we can actually conduct research in the wild, how we can use our own institutions as labs, as places for experimentation. You know, Google, every time you go on Google, every time you go on Bing, every time you go on Amazon or Facebook, you are the subject of an experiment. Google tested 41 shades of blue for its hyperlink color before deciding on which color, which Pantone color it would use to maximize the effectiveness of response. If we can do that for such trivial things as the hyperlink color on Google, we should be thinking more about how we can, in our own work, enable greater experimental design in the way that we solve problems, in the way that we make decisions. Experimentalism is no longer confined to formal scientific labs. It's increasingly a way that startups work, that social policy works, that venture capitalists work, that tech companies work, that universities are coming to, and I hope will work more in this vein, even when it's not practical to create the perfect control group, even when we can't create perfect parallel interventions, we still have opportunities to test what works, to be experimental, not in spite of our duty as stewards of the public trust, but precisely because of our responsibility to the public to improve upon the ways that we govern and make decisions today. The first thing that we have to do is to be very clear, and this last image, let me explain. The first way in which we do that is to focus first and foremost always on the problem that we have the opportunity to solve, on very carefully and tightly defining what those problems are. This picture is a tool that I helped to create called the Public Projects Canvas. Some of you may be familiar with a thing called the Business Model Canvas. It's a kind of 20-question, single-page worksheet that helps you think about, as an entrepreneur, how to launch your product in the world. Well, for those of us who are trying to serve the public trust and the public good, we too need to have our own version of a business model canvas. We need to be thinking about what are the problems that we are trying to solve. What's the data that we can use to solve those problems? Who are the stakeholders that we're trying to serve, and how might we engage with them using new collaborative techniques like crowdsourcing or what's often called human-centered design, engaging with the people who are our end users to help understand the problem and to help brainstorm new solutions to the challenges that we're facing. Our public institutions, be they government in its broadest sense, including universities, federal, state, local level, it's incumbent upon us to improve and to upgrade how we make decisions and how we solve problems. But it's going to be impossible to convince the politicians, to convince the policymakers, let alone the public that we serve, to transform how we do things without greater experimentation and without greater innovation, without trying some of these new techniques like open data and data collaboratives and smarter crowdsourcing and prizes and challenges and many more besides. We need to test the impact of those innovations on improving people's lives. And that I would put to you as the challenge that we face. It's also the opportunity that we have available to us, and particularly as stewards of and leaders in technology in public institutions, I would put it to you as the challenge that you face and that you should embrace so that we can improve, not only, again, our own institutions, but the wider world, the broader public, and the strength of our own democracy. So with that, let me stop and see what comments, questions, discussion we want to have. Always the long silence as people, the brave first victim.
Well, I figured I'm not shy, so I'll step up. My name is Keith McIntosh. I'm a CIO at the University of Richmond. And I'm a big fan of using data. I'm a big fan of using crowdsourcing, so I really enjoyed your talk today. But I'm a big fan, but not a lot of the people around my institution, they're not big fans. And you talked about culture. That is a very limiting factor. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how we as IT leaders can approach our partners around the campus about how to effectively, one, embrace the use of data, and then just to think more broadly about how we collect and use it?
So let me just, before you sit down, let me just ask you back a question.
Dang it.
Sorry.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I have to teach tomorrow, so I want to hear what I'm going to miss tomorrow, which is the cultural resistance that you are experiencing, would you say it's that fear of saying we don't know? It's a fear of being experimental? It's that people don't know how to do these things? What's your sense as to it'll cost too much? What's all of the above, none of the above?
Well, I think everything that you've mentioned, the two or three that really highlight where I'm at currently. One is, folks, the time, it's time management, because I think we're transitioning how we work. I think modern day, you need to incorporate data in your day-to-day lives and how you want to make decisions. Folks who have come up through the pipeline for the years have done things a certain way, and then maybe data sat over there. So there's a fear of, there's a timing and a capacity to work with it. That's one. Then there's a fear of how you're going to use it. Like, if we start using data and I'm the resident expert, and then now more people have access to information, what does that mean to me? Do I lose credibility around the institution? So there's things like that. Yeah. But also, I think, I recently went on a listening tour at my campus, and I did the same thing at my previous campus, asking folks about big thorny issues and problems that they're trying to solve gave me a bunch of deer in the headlight looks.
Deer in the headlights, yeah.
Right? You know what I mean by that? I'm a country boy, so I use a lot of country vernacular. My Texas peeps might be able to handle that. But does that make sense? Can I sit down?
I'm the child of farmers, so it's okay. Yes, you can stand, you can sit as you like, because I don't know that I think the answers, again, are going to come collectively from the wisdom of the room, but let me offer a few ideas here. So this resistance is, I think we all have seen this, are all still experiencing, and no matter how many examples I give, and I can talk about big data, and everybody, you feel at some point like, hasn't everybody heard enough about big data? But it is still a very long path from here to there. Let me tell you a story I heard this week. I had for my class, I interviewed online the head of the innovation lab for the city of Quito in Ecuador. And I asked him about what the sort of greatest lesson learned was. First of all, why they set up an innovation lab, why they created this thing called a lab, and then what the greatest lesson learned. He said, so first of all, and I've heard this time and time again, this notion, and we now have in in governments, I'm not speaking about universities per se, but public institutions generally, we're seeing hundreds of these quote-unquote labs springing up, precisely to create a safe space for experimentation to one side of the traditional institutional hierarchy. Because it creates that, it creates a free space where people can try new things. It's explicitly to one side of the traditional reporting channels, and it helps to create an excuse. Like you can then just do stuff without asking, a permission-free culture. They said the number one thing we did was not ask permission. The number two thing they did was not ask for money. As soon as you ask for money, then it becomes very difficult to innovate because you have to justify your budgets. And number three, which relates to the not asking for money, was to pick very quick win, short projects, high impact 90-day projects. So we can't solve all problems in 90 days, but if you can demonstrate, for example, that by using an open data source, or by crowdsourcing a question, or by, for example, bringing in a fellow from outside or somebody who's coming from a different culture, a different place to work with you, you were able to solve a problem that somebody cared about in 90 days. It helps to give you that longer leash that allows you to innovate. There's another question, so I want to take that and then maybe I can come back to some of the more of the questions about, there's an implicit question about that data-driven culture, the fear that people have that we will drive too many decisions using data. So let me take this comment and then maybe we can come back and talk about that because the answer is I don't think we're there yet, but I do think that we have to talk about that concern. So let's bring you into the conversation.
Thank you, Beth. I'm James from Freshform, a partner of Texas A&M. I wanted to ask you if I could maybe shed some light on your anecdote about spiders, and then I'll ask you a question. So in England, it rains a lot, over 300 days a year. There are 30 spiders per household in the UK, and they only come out when it is sunny. So maybe that's why Mark was trying to find it, or find them, and not able to.
It's a fascinating piece of data.
The actual question was around security and cybersecurity, and I'd love your point of view on this. There was an article I read about giving more personal data to security analysts and companies to help with cyber fraud and cyber attacks. Very much the way Amex or some of the credit card companies will model personal purchase behavior and tell you if you have fraudulent activity on an account. And a lot of people are resisting the fact that they want to give more data, but in fact it could help people not to get their systems hacked, their emails hacked. And I was just very interested in your point of view on that conundrum.
So this is, I'll give you a related, let me bring the spiders and the question together, which is, it sounds like at one point you may not have been from Texas, but the British NHS, the National Health Service in Britain, as a public health system of the kind you have in Europe, sits on all of the country's health data. And they attempted to create a project called care.data, whereby they would anonymize and make available population-level data across the whole system and try to then, on a private basis, internally be able to use more private data to solve problems. And it was a huge media debacle because people didn't know how their data was being used, they didn't know what the privacy and security of their data would be, and the challenge on the other side is, if you actually have large-scale data about the whole population, you can solve tremendous numbers of problems, you can accelerate the rate of research that you can do, but the whole project fell apart because of what I would call the data governance. So to come back to this, as important as the availability of data and the collection of data are the practices for responsible use of data across the data life cycle. And I didn't have time to go into some of the details on the slides, which I'm happy to share, but every stage of that data collection life cycle, from collection to use to analysis to publication, has a set of challenges about what it means to be an ethical and responsible user of data. And I think that's where the challenge comes very much out of this community and to this community to be able to steward those kinds of processes so that we're asking ourselves, are we collecting the right data? Are we sharing it in ways that are responsible with regard for cybersecurity and with privacy? Are we communicating to people how we're using their data? So one last example on this front. My students right now are working with a hospital system, the Mount Sinai Hospital system right now, because they want to take advantage of the fact that technology makes it possible for you to use clinical data for research. So right now you have clinical data, right? I go to the doctor, my doctor types whatever, my blood pressure into my health record. And over here you have clinical trials. The idea is, why can't I combine the two and just extract the data from the clinical records to use for research purposes? And it opens up huge possibilities. Even better when I can anonymize that data and make it available to more researchers, then I could get more eyeballs on the problem, dramatically accelerate the pace of research. None of this is possible without responsible data governance. So that's a long kind of non-answer to say that the skills that go beyond the purely technical, to include the ethical, the legal, these questions are going to become increasingly salient as we want to use data more and more, but need to know where the limits are. And this is a beginning to the answer to the question that was asked before, which is, what are the limits of the uses of big data? This is part of the question we have to be asking ourselves, is we need people who are part of the process who are saying, you know what, the data we're collecting is not the full picture. You know what, we don't have the right people looking at the data. You know what, we're collecting data, but we don't have people with the data science skills to actually analyze it. So there's a broad range of challenges that I would put under this umbrella of responsible data governance. That is a skill set we need to be developing and that people will be looking to the IT community to have, even though it's a set of skills that includes the legal and the communications on both ends of the spectrum. So, sorry, that was it's a long, I could talk another hour on this topic. Please.
My name is Juan Garza. The Data Research Services Texas A&M IT reports through me. We have 15 different data sources, including stuff we get from the state of Texas to be able to do some analysis and assessment of students as they come in. But the question I have is, and we've used some of that data, and we're starting a process for data governance, but how do you start balancing policy processes with the inherent value that an open community provides?
Balancing policy processes.
So you have policies
I
and
just didn't hear.
procedures. So you have policies and processes that come from the government on what you can and cannot, privatizing of data. But then you have the second question, really, which you've talked about mostly, is the open solution. How do you balance that equation while still maintaining a data governance structure?
So if I understand I think, again, there's a spectrum. There's anonymized population level data, which can be shared openly, fully on the open end of the spectrum. In other words, published online, freely downloadable, reusable by other people, which then have to be tied to the right questions that can be answered with population level data sets. And then, as you're pointing out, at the other end of the spectrum, you have personally identifiable student record data governed by statute in some cases, in terms of which cannot be published as open data, and then you have things in between. So partly, I think what we're seeing also with a lot of these data collaborative models is ways in which we can make use of data at that other end of the spectrum. Let me give you one quick example. It's a very intriguing model, but it's very new. So in the UK, the Ministry of Justice has created something that they call the Data Lab. They are sitting on personally identifiable criminal justice data, knowing that it's extraordinarily valuable for doing impact evaluation of new kinds of programs and interventions. What they've done is create a process whereby they have three, essentially, data scientists sitting on one side of the firewall. You're on the outside, let's say, having tried a new educational intervention or after-school program, whatever it is. You take your list of names, you throw it over the firewall, they run the query for you, pass it back to you, and say, here's how your intervention is working. There are limits to the success of this model because, for all kinds of reasons, maybe you're working with the most at-risk youth, maybe the population that you're working with is, whatever reason, the numbers may they may be deceptive, so there are limits to the success of this model, but it's one very inexpensive way in which a public institution has tried to address this problem of how to make private data more useful to third parties that I think merits some looking at. And I think there's a couple of new models springing up for how to do this, either by sending people inside to look at the data, throwing the query over the firewall, putting out anonymized data, putting out, sort of fake, sort of a dummy data that models the data. But I think what we're starting to see, and this is all very new, is some of these experiments.
So an example of that was the Census Bureau with universities.
Say that.
The Census Bureau currently is asking universities to provide information so they can track the livelihood and the impact that a student population and what they receive over time for their livelihood from a funding standpoint. It's going
Right.
through the IRS and the Census Bureau.
The IRS and the Census Bureau, and there's some philanthropic funders like the Arnold Foundation who've stepped in to try to make some of that data more, to create opportunities for more people to use that data, again, in secure and responsible ways. But this spectrum, especially if you're an educational institution, you have to be concerned with the data that's not at the open end of the spectrum, but that's at the other end, and how we generate value from there. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, stories? Yes.
Right, Rick McMullen, Texas A&M College Station. So I had one definition and maybe a couple of questions. The definition is that the definition of innovation is the application of existing technologies to solving current problems. And I think in terms of what you've been talking about, there are lots of potential good outcomes. I think there are some fundamental issues that aren't addressed. One of them is, I would challenge anybody in this room to give some detailed accounting of where their information is that they have exhausted, how it's being used, and if they have any rights or controls to that data. So this is not, it's a social problem, but it's also a technology problem. And I think, before too much time goes on, there ought to be some social pressure applied to solving this as a technological problem. And just by way of a random example, I'd say that perhaps blockchain technology, is a potential direction to go in. So that's, I guess, the social point. The second social point is that I don't know if everybody here would agree with me, but I think that there is sort of a lack of numeracy in all aspects of our public and private life here. And so that makes it very hard when you get to dealing with questions about uncertainty quantification and the quality of the data and using data in general to make major policy decisions. And there are some countervailing things. There's political and social pressure against using data to solve some pressing problems like water management. And I'm speaking directly of weather and climate there. So that's kind of the second point that I think should be addressed through the kind of initiatives that you're talking about. And I guess the third one is, Jaron Lanier said whoever has the most data wins, but also he said whoever has the biggest computers and the most data wins. And the major effect there was the biggest computers. So I'd just question how the use of open data and democratizing these things could be impacted by the availability of having better computing resources that are available to people and not to just special people, but all the people, and whether that's even possible.
Oh boy. That was, I'm being told I have like 3 seconds, 3 minutes in which to not answer what were extremely good comments. So let me say something wholly unsatisfying. So first of all, yes. So real quick, as to the numeracy question, I think that's where we have to think about the partnerships question is so important because it's not just about sharing or exchanging data, it's about talent exchanges. Even as we're seeing, and part of this problem is generational. I'm amazed. I'm at a law school this year instead, which is how I'm trained. instead of in an engineering school, which is my home base. I have an amazing number of students who have degrees in computer science, statistics, computational social sciences, degrees that, we couldn't add two numbers when I was in law school, and it wasn't asked of us to do that. In turn, next week I'm running workshops on R for law students because people are beginning to realize that numeracy is extraordinarily important. It gets to your last point, which is the long tail of data use. Yes, Facebook has the biggest servers. Google has the biggest servers. But the great part with open data, with truly open data, is that it allows lots more people, including the kid in the coffee shop, to take a data set and potentially generate public value from it, especially if we can identify the problems that we're trying to solve, if we can hone people's attention in on doing well by doing good using that data, we can get the person with a few limited skills and a small server to be able to, I think, generate some public value. Even if it's just an app which tells you where to find the public restrooms, something I think that generates a lot of value in a lot of places. And it's not, earthquake predictions and risk mitigation. Everywhere along that spectrum, there are opportunities, I think, to do well by doing good. I have not begun to answer what are a whole host of very thoughtful questions that I think you will, I hope, grapple with over the next 2 days, and that we will take back to our jobs and our workplaces to think about what we can do differently to, again, create this culture of innovation and experimentation, to try to bring other people along for the ride, and to increase not only a sense of numeracy, but also, I think most importantly, a sense of ethics and a sense of public purpose around how we use technology for the greater good. So with that, let me stop. I'm very happy to follow up with anybody by Twitter, by email, by smoke signal or carrier pigeon, and I would welcome hearing from you, and I wish you a wonderful conference. Thank you.